The Cleveland Cavaliers select Anthony Bennett.
Anthony Bennett is the worst #1 pick in NBA history. Anthony Bennett is not that big of a bust. These statements seem to fully contradict each other, but I'm not sure that's actually the case. Now, not much debate surrounds Bennett being at least one of the worst first overall picks. There's just not much defense to the contrary. His debut comes on October 30th, 2013, in a matchup with the Brooklyn Nets. He plays 15 minutes, drops 2 points and 5 rebounds, but those 2 points actually came from 2 of his 4 free throw attempts. He missed all 5 of his shots from the field. The #1 pick wouldn't make a basket in the NBA till his 5th game.
Miles splits the D. Bang! Bang! It's good!
He had gone 0 for 15 in his first 4 games. Even in the game where he made this shot, he went 1 for 5. Of the first 35 shots in his career, he made 4. Throughout the rest of his rookie season, he would average 4 points, shooting 36% from the field and 25% from 3. This wasn't just one of the worst seasons we've ever seen from a #1 pick. Not just one of the worst rookie seasons we've ever seen, truly one of the worst seasons we've ever seen put together. Towards the end of the year, we already saw him on the bench. He would manage 16 DNPs in a row to conclude the season. Then we see LeBron return to Cleveland, and in the effort to compete as soon as possible, they made the blockbuster trade for Kevin Love, and in the process, Anthony Bennett lands in Minnesota. Year 2 looked, in many ways, very similar to his rookie season. He averaged 5 points and 4 rebounds, shooting 42% from the field and 30% from 3. Just like the year prior, he was relegated to the bench to close out the season. He was then waived by Minnesota and signed with Toronto. He would play 19 games in the 2016 season, averaging just 4 minutes, 1.5 points, shooting 30% from the field and 21% from 3. Ahead of the 2017 season, he would sign with Brooklyn, where he played 23 games, averaging 5 and 3. That would be the last time we ever saw Anthony Bennett on an NBA court. He would then go overseas and play in the Turkish League, where he actually ended up winning a EuroLeague title. But that was appearing in just 10 games for 6 minutes on average, shooting 26% from the field. It's safe to say his presence really had no impact on that title. His next 2 years would be spent in the G League, where he actually played pretty well, averaging 16 on remarkable efficiency. That play landed him another NBA opportunity, this time with the Houston Rockets, who signed him to a 1-year, $1.7 million deal ahead of the 2020 season. But after undergoing knee surgery in October, he was waived before the start of the year. He then had extremely small stints in Puerto Rico, then Israel, and has spent the last 2 seasons playing in Taiwan. Okay, it's pretty clear that Anthony Bennett is a bad player by NBA standards, easily the worst #1 pick in the history of the game. So how is he not that big of a bust as I mentioned earlier? Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm here with you today in defense of my client, Mr. Bennett, who's been wrongfully accused of being one of the biggest busts in NBA history. He's a victim of a lazy, unjustified narrative. Throughout the years, we've seen players tagged with tons of different titles: bust, steal, role player, star, superstar, and the most heavily debated, GOAT. The latter is where we actually find the foundation of this case, and that's context. It's what defines the GOAT debate today, and it's needed to justify whoever you're going to give that title to. LeBron is the all-time scorer. He's been to the NBA Finals 10 times, but he's walked away with just 4 rings. This lack of rings is why many put Michael Jordan ahead of LeBron. 6 championships with 6 Finals MVPs, while being the undisputed top player in the league for every single one of those titles. But if it's championship success that carries that much weight in this debate, then isn't Bill Russell the greatest player of all time? He won 11 championships, more than any player in NBA history. Well, it takes just the tiniest bit of context to see why those 11 rings don't carry the same weight as someone as, let's say, Michael Jordan. When Jordan won his first title in 1992, there were 27 teams in the league. When he won his last, there were 29. Bill Russell's dominance came in the very early stages of the NBA, a time that came with a much different level of talent. In a lot of ways, it was a much different sport than we know today. But the most important detail in regards to those championships is that when Bill Russell won his first 4 titles, there was a whopping 8 teams in the league. For his next 5 titles, there were 9. When he won his 10th, there were 12. When he won his final, there were just 14. Now, this is a piece of context that's been added to the GOAT debate for decades. But over the last few years, we've seen significantly more context added as LeBron James has put together a better and better resume. The debate's really just become a debate of context, the value of championships for individual players in a team sport, the pathway to those titles, the era, the teammates they played with, the value of individual accolades. It goes on and on and on. So you might be asking, what does the GOAT debate have anything to do with Anthony Bennett and the conversation surrounding the biggest bust of all time? Well, that GOAT debate is the prime example of how important context is. Labeling Anthony Bennett as one of the biggest busts in NBA history is like labeling Sam Jones as a top 5 player of all time because he's got 10 championships, the second most in league history. Sam Jones is a 5-time All-Star, a great player, no doubt about that, but by no means at the top of all-time rankings. See, my client, Mr. Bennett, is a bust. I don't think anyone in this room, including my client, will object to that. But when you search for the biggest bust in NBA history, there's not going to be a name more commonly brought up or displayed in a YouTube thumbnail. And that's what's completely unjustified. Now, the first thing that everyone is going to jump to, what's going to define the prosecution's argument, is that he was the #1 pick. And this is very true, but we've already established the extreme disparity in the value of certain championships. Well, that same disparity is found in the draft. Your Honor, I would like to submit the defense's Exhibit A into evidence. The 2013 draft class. One of the worst drafts in NBA history. Now, there's 2 ways to value a draft. How successful the draft went on to be, and the perception of the draft at the time, the value of those selections. Both of which lead to the conclusion that the 2013 draft is one of the worst in history. But the latter is the most important one to focus on. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm sure each and every one of you all have your own classifications for the term bust. It's an extremely subjective topic, but the consensus definition is a player who does not perform up to expectations. The one problem with a definition that broad is that would make 90% of the league busts. DeAndre Ayton, RJ Barrett, even D'Angelo Russell would be on track to be lumped into that definition. Fine players, but yet to reach their lofty pre-draft expectations. We don't typically see these players labeled busts. We also don't typically see this tag given to players taken with late draft capital. Maybe there wasn't super high expectations, but it was still higher than the little they brought. We've unofficially decided not to call these guys busts to avoid most of the league being one. That makes sense. We reserve the title for the players with the highest level of expectations. But because we've lacked a proper way to quantify those levels, most have settled with the simple formula of what pick they were taken with and what did they do in the league. A calculation that would quite possibly put my client in a tier of his own in terms of the biggest bust in history. But I ask you today to rethink that formula. Think of it instead of something like trade value. We've got 2 players here. They both average 30 points a game on great efficiency, but one's close to untouchable, as a trade of fair value is nearly impossible to pull off, while the other could be had for some unproven young guys and some future protected draft capital. Why is that? Well, the first player's in his 2nd season. He's currently on a rookie scale contract. He might not even be touching his ceiling, and he's still years out from even being a restricted free agent, likely tying him to your team for the next 7+ years. The other's 35 years old. He's currently on the last year of his contract, a contract that right now is paying him $40 million for the season. On the basketball court right this second. For the sake of this example, these 2 bring the same exact value, but they have 2 completely different trade values. And while we all know that different #1 picks have different values based on the players that are tied to those selections, the Spurs' top selection this season, which guaranteed Wembanyama, for example, this goes overlooked in regards to the bust conversation. Well, that's not 100% true. There is an exception to that. We do have conversations surrounding a disappointing selection going before or instead of another more successful player. Johnny Flynn over Curry, Greg Oden over Durant, Marvin Bagley over Luka Doncic. We do see situations like this raise someone's ranking in the exclusive list of biggest busts. And while in some situations it's relevant, not always. It's only relevant in tandem to pre-draft expectations and perceived value of those selections used. Glenn Robinson III, drafted 1 selection ahead of Nikola Jokic, is nowhere to be seen in bust conversations for obvious reasons. What is relevant is not what these players did in the NBA, but who they were at the time of the draft. When you go back to the profiles of Luka Doncic compared to Marvin Bagley or Kevin Durant to Greg Oden, you can make the case that these teams passed on legitimately better prospects. That's a situation where it might make sense to raise their level of bust, especially if the team differed from consensus. But with individual prospect rankings so heavily debated even ahead of the draft, it'd be hard to find a consensus, unless we had evidence of the 2 prospects representing significantly different trade values on draft night. As we said earlier, one of the few ways we might be able to quantify a bust. Your Honor, I would like to call my first witness, a Western Conference executive just days before the 2013 draft. The only way a trade gets done is when there's a consensus #1. Not only is there no consensus #1 right now, there's no consensus #2, 3, 4, or 5 right now. My second witness of the day is another Eastern Conference executive speaking in regards to the Cavaliers potentially trading for the top pick. Probably wouldn't get much. Then I would like to call Mr. Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN, reporting for Yahoo at the time. For the Cavaliers, the 2013 draft represented the third time this decade the franchise landed the number 1 pick. Those were easy choices, draft night celebrations. This time, number 1 felt more like an albatross than a blessing, in a perpetual state of pre-draft crisis. The Cavaliers front office searched out trade scenarios and talked themselves in and out of players. They never stopped hoping for someone to bail them out. Then we have former Phoenix Suns GM Ryan McDonough, who outlined his trade negotiations with the Cavaliers leading up to the draft. I believe the deal was the 5th pick and 30th pick for number 1 in taking on Alonzo G's contract. And there it is. That right there gives you an idea of what kind of value surrounded the number 1 pick, the 5th pick, the last selection of the first round, basically a second rounder, and a contract that, based on Mr. McDonough's statements, you're probably thinking was absurd and extremely crippling, that taking it on represented a big portion of this deal. Well, Alonzo G had 1 year left on his contract, getting $3.2 million. This puts the value between 1 and 5 at basically a little more than a second round pick. For some context, this would be Asar Thompson and Kobe Brown for Victor Wembanyama this year, Jalen Suggs and Santi Aldama for Cade Cunningham in 2021. So what happened here? Well, not only was there not much separating 1 and 5, there just wasn't much separating the top 10 or so prospects in this draft. The only value that came with being higher was the choice of these similarly tiered prospects. In fact, with just 3 minutes left on the clock to get their selection in, the Cavaliers didn't even know who they were taking, at least according to Mr. McDonough's statement. It's unlikely we're ever going to see a draft like this again. We have a lot of years where the top pick is still a conversation leading up to the draft, just a year ago with Paolo, Jabari, and Chet, Wiggins or Parker in 2014, LaMelo, Anthony Edwards, or James Wiseman in 2020. But in all these scenarios, these players are off the board with the next selection or selections. They represented a separate tier in the draft. 2013 was not like that. It's an anomaly that seems closer to fiction than reality. So now, people of the jury, I want to direct your attention to the options. Exhibit B, Bleacher Report's mock draft released on draft day, has the Cleveland Cavaliers taking Maryland 7'1" center Alex Len, the moderate at best athlete that just averaged 12 points, 8 rebounds, and 2 blocks a game, someone that had just underwent surgery for a partial stress fracture in his left ankle. Would this selection have changed how we look back at this draft in regards to the biggest bust in history? Apparently, a Lynn Tristan Thompson frontcourt was going to be dangerous in a couple years. But while that didn't happen, he has stuck around the league to this day. He's undoubtedly had a way better career than my client, but his 7 points and 6 rebounds a game throughout his career would still put him as one of the worst number 1 picks in league history. Now let's go over to Exhibit C, USA Today's The Common Sense 2013 mock draft. Here they have the number 1 pick being a 6'5" guard coming off a really impressive season at Kansas, especially beyond the perimeter, Ben McLemore. Someone whose profile on paper looks really good, but off the court concerns, defense, and a lack of playmaking really tempered the expectations. He would go on to have a career as a role player, averaging 9 points a game. Then we reach the most common player mocked, Nerlens Noel, the one player that everyone agreed on was an elite prospect. A year ago, he was the clear top guy. To start the season, he only solidified that with Kentucky. He averaged 11 points, 10 boards, 2.1 steals, and 4.4 blocks. Remarkable. He had the frame, 6'11" with a 7'4" wingspan, the speed, the athleticism, and the defensive ability to dominate at the NBA level. In a game on January 29th, he blocked 12 shots, and that was against the 16th ranked team in the country. But there was just one issue in regards to him in this 2013 draft. A pretty big issue at that. In a game against the Florida Gators, he would tear the ACL on his left knee. His game relied on his athleticism. If that took a big hit post-recovery, the outlook was bleak. But with the chance still there that it didn't, he was the clear top pick favorite. Now, since getting to the NBA, he's put together a decent career as a role player. 7 points, 6 rebounds, and solid defense. Had he ended up going at the very top of the draft, he still would have been one of the most disappointing number 1 picks in history. Then there's the dark horse selection. My client, Mr. Anthony Bennett, the 6'8", 240-pound power forward that brought an interesting combination of strength, speed, face-up, and back-to-the-basket game. A poor man's Carmelo Anthony that was coming off a freshman season at UNLV, averaging 16 points and 8 rebounds, shooting 53% from the field, and 38% from 3. But coming from a small program, concerns surrounding what position he would play at the next level, and an injury to his rotator cuff that required surgery made him far from an elite prospect. Now, as we all know, that's who the Cavaliers ended up selecting. But where did those other options for number 1 go? Alex Len didn't go at 2 or 3 or 4. He went with the 5th pick to the Suns. The favorite, Nerlens Noel, would end up going to New Orleans at 6, then traded to Philly, and Ben McLemore would go to the Kings at 7. So just so we're all on the same page, there are 3 selections that separate the Cleveland Cavaliers in their selection of Anthony Bennett and the other reported options they had on draft night. One of those players was Victor Oladipo, who's had easily the best NBA career of these top picks. But he didn't really jump off the paper as a prospect. He was 6'4" at the 2. He had spent 3 years in college. He was super efficient and a lethal slasher, but had taken just over a 3 a game through his 3 seasons, averaging less than 34%. Now, even if the Cavaliers really liked him, this selection really wouldn't have made much sense at the time, as they were just a year removed from selecting Dion Waiters with the 4th pick. Then there was Otto Porter Jr., someone that's been really solid in the league when out there, but that's a rare occasion due to injury. Now, when you go back and look at his draft profile, he looks like a great prospect, judging by today's standards. 6'9" with a 7'1" wingspan, averaging 16 points, shooting 42% from 3 as a sophomore at Georgetown. But at the time, no one looked at him as an option at number 1. As USA Today's mock said, the best fit might be Otto Porter, but he lacks the upside to go first. He was really just deemed a safe pick, a future really solid role player, a profile that didn't make a lot of sense for a young Cavaliers team who had no idea they would be getting LeBron James the following season. Then we ended up seeing the Charlotte Bobcats make a super surprising selection at 4, going with Indiana star forward Cody Zeller, someone who didn't take the jump from his freshman season most were expecting, and was also bringing serious concerns in regards to his upside in defense at the NBA level. This selection is really the perfect example of just how lumped together these prospects were in the draft. He's someone you could have found in mocks outside the top 10. Now, the counter argument to the value of these selections you're probably going to hear from the prosecution centers around this trade between the Pelicans and 76ers. The Pelicans gave up the 6th overall pick Nerlens Noel and a future first for Pierre Jackson, a 2nd round selection, and Drew Holiday, someone that was only 22 years old and coming off his first All-Star appearance. But as is with this entire case, context needs to be provided. This was a very unique circumstance, more right place, right time than anything. While the 4-year, $41 million contract extension he had signed in October seems like a steal today, 2013 was a different time. Bleacher Report in an article just after the deal said, $10 million plus a year contract for Holiday won't be easy to digest for some. CBS said, slightly, but not terribly overpaid, depending on how he works out. The sentiment at the time was clearly that this contract had already priced in the potential that Holiday had. Now, with that said, many still deem this draft night trade a huge win for the Pelicans. But the most important context here is the situation the 76ers were in. This was the early beginnings of general manager Sam Hinkie's trust the process, what would go on to be the most blatant tank in NBA history. What this trade represented to them was sending away a player that might win them too many games for a player that had high potential, but that wouldn't be seen till the future, with him likely to miss the season recovering from injury. Sam Hinkie saw what was ahead in the 2014 draft. 2 elite prospects that were already making the cover of Sports Illustrated. He wanted to be in position for those guys and was going to do whatever it took. In fact, Nerlens Noel likely represented less value in this trade than that future first-round pick, as it was the Pelicans selection in 2014, a team that, despite having a star in Anthony Davis, was still a young roster likely to give the 76ers another chance in the lottery, something that ended up happening. That's how this trade happened. You can go pretty much a decade in either direction from this 2013 draft, and any of the top 3 picks, usually top 5, sometimes top 7, 8, 9, 10, would be the number 1 pick in 2013. Let's just go ahead 2 years. Exhibit F, the Justice Winslow trade offer. The Boston Celtics had their eyes set on Winslow, but it was extremely unlikely he would be on the board for their selection at 16. So reportedly, they offered the Charlotte Hornets, sitting at 9, 6 first-round picks, including 4 future firsts, one being just 7 picks later, and another being the Nets selection a few years from that point, which would go on to become the 3rd overall pick Jaylen Brown. This is according to the Ringer's Bill Simmons. This was for the 9th pick, which wasn't even used to get Winslow. Charlotte ended up going with Frank Kaminsky. Take a look at the comparison of these 2 reported offers. The 5th pick and the 30th pick for the Cavaliers' number 1 pick. versus 6 future picks, including 4 firsts, for not the first pick, not a top 5 pick, the 9th pick in the draft. Now this situation is extreme, but it is direct evidence of just how out of the conversation Anthony Bennett is in regards to the biggest bust of all time. In fact, the value associated with that 9th pick used to select Kaminsky and the 10th pick used to select Winslow actually put them in a completely incomparable tier of bust, at least compared to my client. Even considering the moderate but clearly superior value Winslow brought in stretches of his career, Anthony Bennett did not come in with high expectations. The selection used to get him didn't represent much value at all. The Cavaliers' other options at 1 would have produced very similar outcomes. Would Alex Lynn's mediocre at best career save him from being listed in every bust article or YouTube video like Anthony Bennett? The answer is likely not. Anthony Bennett represents the 2013 draft, a draft that was a bust. In order to suggest otherwise, you have to mention the success stories throughout its entirety. CJ McCollum, Rudy Gobert, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. But to enter those guys into the conversation, you have to ignore expectations and most importantly, draft position, the basis of Anthony Bennett being one of the biggest busts of all time.